It's good to see you all. If I were you, I would turn to the Gospel of Matthew chapter 18. We're going to begin by looking at one verse there, verse 20 particularly. I expect that we're able to give the Lord the best 30 or so minutes of our attention. If at any point your little one is not enjoying the sermon, there's nursery downstairs. Just no adults sneaking away, please. Let's keep you all in the sanctuary. Matthew 18, verse 20, I want to open with this text. I'm going to skip in a few words, but you'll see where I'm at. Where two or three, this is Jesus speaking. Where two or three gather in what? In my name. What is Jesus' corresponding promise? There am I with them. I'm going to read it from a bit of an older translation. I like the poetic nature, if you will, of the King James. Where two or three are gathered in my name, Jesus said, there I am in the midst of them. I love that. Based upon this enduring word, we affirm that Jesus Christ is present as we gather in his name. Consider the reality that the Lord is uniquely present in our midst this morning. That he's here. And as I always say, if he's here, then there are things that he wants to do. And there are truths that he wants to communicate. And there are changes in your heart that he wants to make. There are visions that he wants to give. There are plans and dreams within you that are in sync with his plans and dreams that he wants to birth. How many realize that God is always active? He's always up to something. He may be unchanging, but he is dynamic by nature. And I personally, like many of you, I revel in the assurance that regardless of time, location, place, country, and beyond, that if people, even two or three, will gather in his name, that he will uniquely manifest amongst them. However, and here's the key foundational point for this morning. Do you want to know what else is present where two or three are gathered, even in his name? Drama, discord, strife and disunity, in the presence and the operation of this thing that we will lovingly call offense. He may be here with us, but we're still here too, with all of our baggage, our issues, and our tendencies to wound and or be wounded by one another. And unless you plan to live under a rock or as a recluse, you are going to have to properly navigate this thing called offense. It is a stumbling block on the path of faith that has derailed many sincere people. And as your pastor, I want to say here and at home, it need not derail you. I want to offer, based upon this premise, a multi-part series that if you put into practice, following the admonition of James, don't just listen to the word, but do what it says, you'll be the better off for it. What does it mean to be offended? Don't answer out loud, but I want you to imagine that you're at home, you're reading something in your devotionals, it talks about offense, the Bible brings up the word offense, a devotional that you're reading mentions the topic of offense. What does it mean to be offended? You ready for my definition? Here we go. It means that someone has managed to irritate or anger, I'm going to use the more modern millennial word, trigger you in some way. As I age, I'm trying to learn the millennialese. It's not easy because they have a lot of interesting words. One of them is trigger. It means that someone has managed to trigger, irritate, or anger you. They've done something to slight you, wound you, or negatively impact you through words and actions and beyond. And ultimately, offense is a universal human experience. All eyes this way by the raising of a hand, and don't lie, both should be up already. Who's ever been offended in the sound of my voice? We've experienced offense in the world, in the workplace, with our neighbors. Amongst family is very common. Who finds it sometimes difficult to deal with family? Everyone nervously laughs. Who's experienced offense in the church world, in the church setting? I promise, get to know me long enough, I'll find a way. I'll offend you. And it's unknowing, it just happens, because I'm human just like you. The local community of faith is a great place, in a negative sense, to experience offense. It turns out that sheep bite one another at times. So if you're going to be a part of any community, secular or spiritual, guess what? You're going to have to deal with this thing called offense. One author likens offense to a seed that is planted by others. And that seed, if allowed, will begin to spring forth a toxic crop of fruit that affects us horizontally and vertically in terms of our relationships. Offense, in my notes, can catalyze resentment, bitterness, unforgiveness, hatred, malice, and a whole host of other things that are utterly contrary to the work of the Lord in your life. But let's be honest, how many of us find it awfully easy to traffic in those things? So in a sense, talking about offense, it's not only a timeless thing, but it seems to be always timely. Because offense is a cancer that can quickly spread. Those who are offended, if you allow offense in, if you allow it to fester, you can drown in those vices we mentioned, bitterness, hatred, and beyond, which will bring ruin, in a sense, to your relationship with the Lord, and it will also spill into your relationship with others. I love people that love God but hate people. They're out there. The church world is full of them. They love the Lord, but they just can't seem to play well with others. Now, biblically, that's not really in sync with truth, because those who love the Lord, it will be the nature to love others. So keep that in mind. The one who brought the offense, pastor does something stupid or says something a bit wrong, knowingly or unknowingly, we can experience alienation and loss of friendship. How many have been offended by people, and if you're honest, the person didn't even really mean to offend you, but it still affects how you treat them in reply? And ultimately, the surrounding body of peers and family and onlookers, they can experience negative results as well, as our wounding and our hurt isn't properly resolved. We don't go to the person and practice being a peacemaker. Instead, we talk to it, or we talk about it to other people who aren't even involved. And now they begin to look at that offensive party, knowingly or unknowingly, in a wrong way. Offense is a great way to wreck a marriage. It's a great way to wreck a friendship. It's a great way to wreck a church community. Most church splits, I'm willing to bet, if you trace them all the way back to their point of origin, start right here in the failure to properly navigate this thing called offense. So this morning I want to spend a little bit of time talking about why we're so easily offended. Because it's easy to be offended. It takes a certain degree of strength, self-control, commitment to the Lord in prioritizing Him and His ways and applying Him and His ways, in a sense, to overcome these things. So why are we so easily offended? I want to give you a bit of a laundry list this morning. How many are ready to learn? And if you're ready to learn, put it into practice. Your relationships will be the better for it. Number one is a simple one. You ready? Pride. We are easily offended because the words or the actions of another offends our sense of pride. Since Genesis chapter 3, literally page 1 or 2 of the Bible, we as humans, fallen humans, have been passionately, wholeheartedly, and recklessly obsessed with ourselves. We possess a focus that is nearly always inward in nature as we function as the center of our worlds. I mean it when I say it. How many of you were born prior to July of 1978, which is the month of my birth? I say this teasingly, but it's true. In my mind, the world began in 1978. I've always been the center of my world. So people that were born in the 40s, 50s, and 60s, I can't imagine your world because your world didn't include me in it. And we all operate as the center of our universes. Consider how often you think about you. If you're honest, let's be honest for a moment, it's kind of gross how often we think about ourselves. I like the words of Oscar Wilde. Come over here and sit next to me. I'm dying to tell you about myself. I like this little story. On a cold winter's day, A crowd of people stood in front of a pet shop window and watched a litter of puppies snuggling up to each other. What a wonderful scene, isn't it? One woman laughed and said, "What a delightful picture of brotherhood. Look at how these puppies are keeping each other warm." And a man next to the woman replied, "No, ma'am. They're not keeping one another warm. They're keeping themselves warm." Those who desire to live life and life to the full, per John 10:10, we must deal with this sense of self-obsession. And I'm going to put forth that perhaps the most malignant, cancerous, toxic, sinister element of our fallen nature is our sense of pride. It seems to be the root of essentially all other sins. Those who would be most miserable in life follow the following advice. Think about yourself. Talk about yourself. Use I as often as possible. Mirror yourself continually in the opinions of others. Listen greedily to what people say about you. Expect to be appreciated. Be suspicious. Be jealous and envious. Be sensitive to slights or offense. Never forgive a criticism. Trust nobody but yourself. Insist on consideration and respect. Demand agreement with your own views on everything. Sulk if people aren't grateful to you for the favors that are shown them. Never forget a service that you have rendered. Shirk duties if you can, and do as little as possible for others. Now that is all awful advice. But left to our own extremes, that is the direction that we will tend to pull. The all about me mentality, pride, is fertile soil for being oft and easily offended. Hurt feelings and offenses are almost always the result of being overly occupied with self. Let me give you a few quick examples before we move on. You propose an idea, maybe in the work setting. You have a solution to a problem working with a bunch of peers, and no one likes your idea. How could they not love my contribution? How could they not esteem the input that I have given? Don't they know who I am? No one appreciates your unique talents and contributions. Maybe you get overlooked for a position. How many thought you were in line for a promotion, but they chose someone that wasn't you? How could they? People don't pay attention to you to the degree that you think you deserve. I love when someone like Misty says, "Notice that I got a haircut?" And sometimes the answer is no. Or my all-time favorite, I went to that church and no one even shook my hand. If I'm the center of my own universe, how can I not be the center of yours? The truth is I can't be the center of your universe because that position's likely already taken by you. Now, for those who think that people are always thinking about you, I'm going to help some of you. I'm going to fix some wagons right now. You ready? Many of you think that people are always thinking about you. Can I give you a harsh truth? You ready? They're not. In fact, you would be saddened to know how infrequently you appear in their minds at all. Why? Because they're thinking about themselves. It's how we are. Ultimately, when self is dismissed or overlooked or mistreated, when pride is wounded, you have the perfect climate for offense. So my call for you this morning, or to you biblically, let go of pride. And do what the Bible says. Pride brings a person low, but the lowly in spirit gain honor. I'm not calling you to think less about yourself. I'm calling you to think about yourself less. You begin to do that, you'll begin to see things in your relationships change, and you won't be so wounded all the time. How did we all become so victimized all the time? Poor me. You know, we've been watching a lot of Winnie the Pooh these days with our little foster girl in the house. Don't be an Eeyore. Stop thinking about you. Number 2, we're going to move on for the sake of time. Personal insecurities, kind of the outflow of pride, if you will. Go to the book of Genesis chapter 3, way in the beginning of the Bible, probably page 2 in your Bible, quite literally. Genesis chapter 3, I want to look at an excerpt that's going to show you a few things. And again, it's the overflow, if you will, of pride. Personal insecurities. Genesis chapter 3, we're going to pick it up in verse 6. This is following the temptation of the serpent. Things are swell in the garden, great relationships, there's no hard work, things just produce on their own. Life is great. Serpent comes and introduces this idea of eating of the forbidden fruit. And it says in verse 6 of Genesis 3, when the woman saw that the fruit of the tree was good for food and pleasing to the eye. In other words, Satan, in the form of a serpent, is playing upon her senses, if you will, trying to take her gaze spiritually and physically off of the Lord and his ways. And also desirable for gaining wisdom, she took some and she ate it. The next verse angers me, it triggers me. She also gave some to her husband who was what? With her. Adam, put a pitchfork in that thing. We throw the woman under the bus, Eve. Notice that it's when Adam ate of the forbidden fruit that things really fell apart. And he ate it. And it says in verse 7, then, as a result of their disobedience, the eyes of both of them were opened. And what was the first thing that they realized? They realized that they were naked. In other words, what you see is the entrance of shame, vulnerability, feelings of exposure, and personal insecurity enters the human equation for the very first time. So what did they do? They made coverings for themselves. They sought to compensate for those personal insecurities, not by looking to the Lord and his pardon and his transformative work, but taking it upon themselves to remedy things. There's a whole sermon in that. Once they ate of that fruit, their focus shifted tragically from God to themselves. And focused now upon themselves almost exclusively, they began to realize inadequacy, failing, imperfection potentially, flaw, and beyond. From the beginning, from the moment the fall happened, humanity has struggled since with inadequacy and the need to measure up. We all struggle, I don't care who you are, with self-acceptance and an inborn need for others to accept you. We want to fit in, and therefore we are extremely conscientious of our shortcomings and our failures. And when other people begin to key in on them, that is now the climate for offense. Let's say you're insecure about your looks. Not all of us are 10s. There's only a few of us out there. Let's say you're worried about how you look. Don't you love it when someone says to you, gee, you look tired? Who's ever had that said to them before? Come on, be honest. You're already worried about how you're presenting yourself. You try to paint the barn, polish up, make yourself look nice, take a shower, put deodorant on, put a comb through your hair, and all you get as response is, man, you look tired. Are you sick? Are you feeling okay? Let's say you're insecure about your weight. How do you feel when someone potentially gives you a gym membership? I think of those who are newly married. Perhaps the one of the spouse, probably the wife more so, is a bit insecure about her cooking. That was my wife in the beginning, just insecure about how good her food was. Clearly it was good. I like to eat it. You know, how do you feel when your mother-in-law decides to give you some advice or some input, a cookbook potentially? How about marriage? Maybe you're 40 and you're not married yet. Don't you love when folks ask you, what's taking you so long? You're already aware of the issue. You're already feeling it probably more often than not because, again, per our pride, we focus on ourselves. But when someone else keys in on that thing, that is a perfect way to be offended. Sometimes we easily shake things off, and sometimes our personal insecurities trigger offense. Walls go up once our feelings are hurt, and we fall prey now to the enemy of our soul who is whispering awful little nothings into our hearts and minds. And even if the offender meant no harm, even if that person was genuinely concerned about your sleep habits, and are you sleeping sufficiently, we become wounded, and we can easily give in to this thing called offense. Point number 3, I got to begin to move quickly. Assuming the worst. We're easily offended because we all too often assume the worst in others. It is amazing to me how we always see ourselves in the most noble of light while assuming the worst in others. Assumptions are dangerous things. You know what happens when you assume, right? I cannot say the fullness of that statement from the pulpit, but it does contain a measure of truth. I came across a short story. The photographer for a national magazine was assigned to get photos of a great forest fire. Smoke at the scene hampered him, And he asked his home office to hire out a plane. Arrangements were made, and he was told to go at once to a nearby airport wherein the plane would be waiting. Now, when he arrived at the airport, it says a plane was warming up near the runway. So he jumped in with his equipment and he yelled, "Let's go, let's go." And the pilot swung the plane into the wind, and they were soon in the air. "Fly over the north side of the fire," yelled the photographer, "and make 3 or 4 low-level passes." "Why?" asked the one in the pilot's seat. "Because I'm going to take pictures," cried the photographer. "I'm a photographer, and photographers take pictures." After a pause, the pilot paused. "You mean you're not the instructor?" So you see this moment where an assumption was made about another person that was not rooted in truth. I don't know how that story ended. Hopefully it was just a pastoral anecdote. We often make faulty assumptions of one another based upon past experiences, gut feelings, intuition, and again, personal insecurities. And based upon these things, we judge the intents and the motives of another. And though there's no way that we can know for certain, we typically assume the worst in other people. Once again, it's the perfect storm for this thing called offense. I want to move on to the next point because that one is relatively self-explanatory. I'm probably going to have to close with this one for the sake of time. Number 4 is miscommunication. How many of you are married? How many find communication a difficult thing at times? How many have families that you have miscommunication with? I love the following quote. There's an old army proverb apparently that an order that can be misunderstood will be misunderstood. Irish playwright George Bernard Shaw said the following: "The single biggest problem in communication is the illusion that communication has taken place." We experience miscommunication all the time with our spouse, with our parents, with our children, with our neighbors, with our extended family and the crazy uncle that no one wants to talk about. We've experienced it in the church as well, and we also experience the offense that comes along potentially with miscommunication. I want to read a section to you out of John chapter 2. Don't turn there for the sake of time. But I want you to consider the gap between what's being said and how the information is being received and interpreted. Jesus is ministering, it's early in his ministry, and the Jews, the religious leaders, they ask him a question: "What sign can you show us to prove your authority to do what you're doing?" So Jesus answered them, "Destroy this temple, and I will raise it again in 3 days." And they replied, "It's taken 46 years to build this temple, the precincts that they were currently in. And you're going to raise it, you're going to rebuild it in a sense in 3 days?" But the text is clear. The temple that he was speaking about, it wasn't the physical precincts that they were standing in. What was it? It was his own body. So what Jesus had said, which was communicated clearly, was misinterpreted by the people, and miscommunication took place, further widening the gap between Jesus and those who were already out to get him, in a sense. And we do this all the time. We misconstrue, we miscommunicate. A person encounters the pastor immediately following the service. As he's on his way to the office, "Pastor, can I just get a moment?" And maybe the pastor says something along the lines, "Now's not really the greatest time. Can we make a time to talk over the course of the week?" Those kinds of things do happen. But many people may take offense at that and begin to say, "Well, he doesn't have time for me. I'm clearly not a priority." That was not the intention of the pastor in that moment, but that is how it was received. And because we're all fallen beings with pride and a self-consumption and personal insecurity, we can so easily miscommunicate and misunderstand one another. Download my notes on Tuesday or Wednesday, but there are 4 main reasons in terms of why we experience so many misunderstandings. Number 1 is culture. It took Misty, you're in the room. How long did it take you to really acclimate to New England moving from Washington State? Don't lie. 10 years. Still working on it. Are there other transplants here? Are you different parts of the country? So New England is a unique breed. Pastors move here all the time, just to move out just as quickly. I know many pastors that say, "What's wrong with you people?" if they're from down south or another part of the country. We're sarcastic here. Now, I speak sarcasm as a second language. I'm not going to lie to you. Misty, who's a literalist, it didn't go well for the first number of years in our marriage because I thought I was being really funny and she thought that I was just being a jerk. Culture can be a real source of misunderstanding. I can recall going to Ghana many years ago. And for those who ever do overseas work and you travel, you have to learn a little bit of the local custom and culture. And it turns out that if you cross your foot, and you sit like this, and you dare aim your foot towards someone, congratulations, you just offended them over a cultural matter. Because to point the bottom of your foot at someone is to signify that they are beneath you. Now, me being a dumb American, I had no idea. I had to be taught these things. Be a student of culture. Pay attention to other people, especially if they're from different parts of the country. Number two, quickly, is age. There is always going to be a generational gap. And right now, I find myself completely in the middle. The older generations don't make a ton of sense to me, and the younger kids make even less sense than me. I'm officially middle-aged now, I think. I think I'm there. I found a quote that I like. Every generation believes they're smarter than their parents and wiser than their kids. So there are all kinds of misunderstandings and miscommunications that can take place generationally. Don't believe me? Put a kid on the front row, let them have their smartphone open. They're reading the Bible app or they're taking notes, and there's going to be some elder who doesn't even have a cell phone or a smartphone that thinks that they're playing on Facebook the entire time. And how dare they sit in the front row and not hang on every word that the pastor shares? Maybe not at New Life. But we ran into that issue a couple of years ago. Number three is gender. All eyes this way. We still believe in gender here. It's a thing. Not to be mean or rude. There are people that genuinely battle this as an issue. But I am not willing to forfeit biblical truth for personal feelings. Men and women. And we're wired differently. We just are. My wife makes no sense to me half the time. Come on, men, I'm going to give you one moment to be honest. Does your wife really make sense to you? They're too sheepish to say anything. And I'm sure it operates in reverse. She looks at me like an enigma that she lives with. And we're continually having to make sure we're communicating accurately because sometimes genders have very different filters. Final point is personality types. We're all wired so differently. Some of you are extroverts, some of you are introverts, some of you are let's charge and take the mound, some of you are just ready, aim, 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 never fire. I don't know how any of us gets along. I'm not going to lie to you. I can't even get along with myself half the time, and I live with me. I live inside of my own head, and I'm still like, what's the matter with you? It's amazing any marriage works, any friendship works, because we're all wired so differently. And because we're wired differently and we come at things from different vectors in life background choices and a whole host of other things, we can easily miscommunicate and misunderstand. And that climate can create the context where you just get so mad. I love the little kids book, I'm so angry. That's us half of the time. So starting next week, now that we've diagnosed the problem in terms of why we're so easily offended, I want to begin to give you some principles to overcome that thing. In a sense, knowing these principles are half of the battle. Because once you begin to understand why you're so easy to fly off the handle or take things wrongly, you can begin to connect the dots and take some positive steps forward. Again, download the notes on Tuesday, Wednesday. There's so much more notes than I had time to get to. I do want to close in prayer. I want to give one or two brief announcements, so please don't make the 40-yard dash once the pastor says amen. Father, I thank you for this chance to come together. And God, it's a marvel that we play well together at all. But I love that you have a heart for unity. Lord, I think of the prayer of Jesus that he wanted us to be as one, because that's the relationship that he had with you. And we have a long way to go at all times on a micro and on a macro level. But God, as we learn to understand why we're so prone to take offense, we can begin to take proactive steps to bring remedy to that. So that we can, in a sense, reach a point that offense never really gets in because we put your word into action and we'll be the better for it. So we go our separate ways. Add your favor, your blessing. May your grace and peace be upon us all. In Jesus' name, everyone says.